Donald Trump's wildly unpopular vice presidential running mate, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, was publicly humiliated at a press conference when reporters confronted him with questions about his disastrous polls, Donald Trump's insulting rhetoric, and Trump recently denigrating U.S. soldiers. It was as disastrous as you can expect. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, as you know, the current state of the 2024 election is not going well for the Republican ticket. Trump and J.D. Vance together not doing particularly well. Now, that might change, but every time J.D. Vance appears in front of cameras and a microphone, it actually hurts the Republicans' chances even more as far as I'm concerned. So we're going to have several clips to play from this press conference, starting with this one in which J.D. Vance is confronted with the fact that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Vice President Harris's Democratic vice presidential running mate, is just wildly more popular than Vance is.
Sorry.
It's okay. A new ABC Ipsos poll was out today. It shows that Governor Walz, Vice President Harris's running mate, has a higher favorability among Americans than you do. What's your response to that poll? And also, what can you do ahead of the October debate to try to win over more Americans and your campaign?
Well, look, I don't put much stock in polls, especially at this early level. I think Governor Walz was nominated just a couple of weeks ago. He's received a ridiculous media honeymoon where they've hidden, a lot of press have hidden some of the things that he said and done.
Yeah, did the polls suck except the polls that I like, and then those polls are valid, just like Trump, right? Trump loves the polls that are good for him. J.D. Vance loves the polls that are good for him and publicly denigrates polls in general when things don't go his way. Now, listen, my audience has given me flack because I defer to polls even when they're not looking good for us. I talk about it on this channel. The polls are valid. They are used by both Republican and Democratic politicians. They are being used as we speak by Vice President Harris. People are not ignoring the polls. Professionals are not ignoring the polls, nor should we. But it's a terrible answer. The fact of the matter is that J.D. Vance is not particularly charming or well-liked or popular, and it seems unlikely that he's going to turn that around. He's just hoping that Governor Walz has some sort of epic faceplant, which has not happened yet. Another disastrous clip from J.D. Vance from this press conference.
Senator Matt Smith from WISN-TV here in Milwaukee. Coming off just of everything you just talked about, it seems like some allies of former President Trump have said in recent days he needs to focus more on policy, just like you talked about, less personal attacks. I'm curious, have you had that conversation with him, and does he need to pivot, especially when you look to swing states like Wisconsin?
I don't think the president needs to pivot, and if I told him that, I can guess what he'd say.
Right, exactly. He would ignore you and you're too afraid to bring the subject up to him to begin with. I should say that Donald Trump's current strategy of insulting and demeaning his opposition was part of the reason, was one of many reasons, that J.D. Vance, back in 2016, publicly criticized Trump, referred to him as America's Hitler, America's opioid, because he thought he was such a toxic, malevolent presence. Now, of course, J.D. Vance, being the unprincipled, hypocritical loser that he is, he doesn't care about that. He probably secretly does. He probably recognizes that the race is, as of this moment, not going particularly well, in part, not just because of his own unpopularity, but because Trump's demeanor does not engender himself well or themselves well to independents, to moderates. It doesn't actually court people, but he's too afraid to say anything about it. So even when this reporter says, well, actually, you have kind of in a roundabout way said that you need to be nicer and more persuasive. Have you actually said that to Trump? No, I think that everything's great. Pretty pathetic, weak stuff. Now, this clip actually is from a Republican politician from a press conference the day before, but it is relevant to what I'm about to show you, and then we're going to get back into J.D. Vance. This is a Republican politician at a press conference with Vance yesterday saying something really interesting about Donald Trump that Trump then proceeds to totally contradict.
He combated the veteran suicide and took on many of the challenges for disabled veterans in this country. He was the best pro-veteran president that we've had in my lifetime.
So there you go. That's a Republican politician saying that Donald Trump cares a lot about disabled veterans and is in general the best pro-veteran, most pro-veteran president in his lifetime. Well, this is what Donald Trump said later on that day about veterans and U.S. soldiers.
I have to say, Miriam, I watched Sheldon sitting so proud in the White House when we gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead. She gets it, and she's a healthy, beautiful woman. It's and the rate.
Absolutely gross. Okay, that the idea that actually the Presidential Medal of Freedom is much better than the Congressional Medal of Honor because soldiers get the Congressional. That's bad. That's lesser, Trump thinks. And remember, listening to what this Republican politician said about Trump's compassion and support for disabled veterans. This is, remember, Trump just said, and they're in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets or they're dead. So really suggests that Trump not only has contempt for disabled veterans, but veterans in general, whether they're disabled, living, or dead. Interesting stuff. And so the reason that I played those clips was not only to emphasize how hypocritical Republicans are and how disgusting Trump is, but J.D. Vance at the press conference we were playing the clips from in the first few clips was also asked about that. And I want you to hear his cowardly response.
We'll do one more then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator. I wanted to ask you, Trump has been getting attacked from his comments at the press conference yesterday about what he said about the top military honor. And veterans have pointed out that, he said that the civilian presidential honor is better than what wounded veterans have received. And I wondered, what do you say to veterans who think that's demeaning?
Well, look, I was with a group of veterans in Pennsylvania yesterday, and trust me, the veteran community is very, very much behind Donald Trump. So, look, what I would say to people is, look, what President Trump said during a ceremony, and I haven't seen the entire remarks, but my understanding is President Trump said during a ceremony that a person who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he was saying some nice things about her. He was saying some complimentary things about her. Donald Trump, I've seen give out a Congressional Medal of Honor. I've seen him give out a number of awards and commendations to military veterans. And, of course, I myself am a Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War. This is a guy who loves our veterans and who honors our veterans. I don't think him complimenting and saying a nice word about a person who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom is in any way denigrating those who received military honors. They're two different awards, and I think the president was saying some nice things about a person that he liked, and that's
Yeah, so J.D. Vance is visibly struggling and floundering on that one because, listen, I don't think his compliment should really be taken or interpreted as a denigration of soldiers, except when the compliment includes words that denigrate soldiers. How about that, J.D.? Again, one thing that a game you should always play with yourself is, what if a Democrat did it? When you catch a Republican doing something like this, the first thing you should ask yourself is, how would the same Republican act or react if it had been a Democrat who said the thing that they're being asked about? And we all know the answer to this. J.D. Vance would be running with this as a campaign issue. How dare Democratic so-and-so denigrate soldiers? I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. But because it's Trump, his MAGA Republican cult leader, well, just words don't matter, right? I mean, it's just a compliment. Can we really hold a president to his words? Do words matter for presidents? I mean, they do for Democrats. I mean, sometimes, like when it's bad for Democrats, and then the words matter then. But for Republicans, we just got to grade them on a different standard. And by the way, have I mentioned that I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps? I really need to throw that in there. So clearly, I like Trump. Trump's good for veterans. He's good for me. Ergo, what he says about veterans doesn't count. Pretty pathetic, lame, ridiculous stuff. And the press should continue to demand a better answer from J.D. Vance. Again, the press should imagine, how would we react if a Democrat said that? Democrats don't say those sorts of things. So this is what Vice President Harris's campaign said in response. Statement on Donald Trump's dishonoring America's greatest heroes. Again, Donald Trump knows nothing about service to anyone or anything but for himself. For him to insult Medal of Honor recipients, just as he previously attacked Gold Star families, mocked prisoners of war, and referred to those who lost their lives in service to our country as, quote, suckers and, quote, losers, should remind all Americans that we owe it to our service members, our country, and our future to make sure Donald Trump is never our nation's commander-in-chief. Again, on the subject of who's been the best president for veterans, how about President Biden? President Biden and the Democrats were able to pass on a slightly bipartisan basis the PACT Act, which expanded veterans health care. And that was after, and I'll give you a refresher on this, it was after Republican obstruction. Jon Stewart, Democratic activist, stepped in and effectively bullied the Republicans into getting out of the way. And under President Biden, and with Democratic leadership and with Vice President Harris's leadership, healthcare for sick veterans in this country expanded. Okay? So it's really, really gross to hear these Republicans make these excuses and lies. And we'll get into another lie made by a Republican politician from the other press conference I was referencing. But first, as a reminder of Republicans obstructing President Biden's PACT Act, this is a clip from Newsmax and Jon Stewart, who was lobbying on behalf of the PACT Act for sick veterans.
But I did want to point out, just to push back a little bit on this. So the Republicans, when you say what you said, they do not support veterans. The Republicans push back saying there is unrelated spending within this.
It's not. It's just not true. What they're saying is they don't like that it's mandatory as opposed to discretionary. There isn't unrelated spending to it. They're saying there could be if there wasn't oversight, but that's what the Senate's job is. The bill itself is incredibly detailed and prescriptive about what it's for. It's about treating and preventing the different conditions that veterans are coming home with, including cancers and chronic bronchiolitis and all these other issues from their exposures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And to push back on what they're saying, what if this creates a slush fund, right? So are you familiar with something called the OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund?
Fairly, yes.
So every year, $50 billion, $60 billion, $70 billion is added to what's called the OCO, on top of the $600 billion, $700 billion, $800 billion that goes to the Defense Department. That OCO fund is actually a slush fund, $60 to $70 billion every year. No oversight, no guardrails. And every one of those Republicans that voted against health care for veterans voted for the slush fund for the war. They don't support the troops. They support the war machine.
Great stuff from Jon Stewart. Listen, the Democratic Party has its faults, but when it comes to their record on supporting veterans, it is true. Democrats just have an objectively greater record for supporting veterans, whereas Republicans are more inclined to support the war that creates veterans in the first place. Just another example of Republican politicians' moral inferiority, and that's exactly what it is. What Donald Trump said there in any other context would be disqualifying. It would certainly, once upon a time, have disqualified any Republican candidate and probably would still disqualify any Democrat candidate to this day. But Democratic candidates don't say the sorts of ridiculous things that Donald Trump does. Governor Tim Walz is a veteran, much like J.D. Vance. He's never been this crass, nor is Vice President Harris. So yeah, it's pretty pathetic stuff from not just Donald Trump, but also what Donald Trump's sycophants like J.D. Vance have to say in order to cover for his stupidity. Last clip I'll play is a Republican Congressman, Michael Waltz, who said a ridiculous lie when it comes to troops, soldiers, veterans, and war about Donald Trump.
And what we've seen, look what happened in Afghanistan. Under President Trump, no U.S. casualties.
So there were, in fact, 45 related U.S. casualties in Afghanistan, combat related in Afghanistan. We've talked about this before. It's really, really gross to hear these sorts of things, again, from MAGA Republicans. But 45 U.S. combat deaths. This is a Newsweek article, which fact checks this claim. There are others as well, because we talked about this. Of those 65 related U.S. soldier deaths in Afghanistan, there were 45 combat deaths reported in Afghanistan alone, which is about 32 more than occurred under President Biden. So if that's the metric by which we're evaluating presidencies, then again, objectively speaking, Donald Trump is much worse, exponentially worse. And yet Republican politicians are just bluntly lying about it. So really pathetic stuff, terrible record when it comes to troops and veterans and veterans health care. And MAGA Republicans are trying to launder Donald Trump's indifference and callousness. And that's why they should be punished for it at the ballot box in November. Let me know what you think in the comments.